All right, just to start this off, I'm going to ask my one question before starting to film the whole thing. And my question is that Ibrahim loves to paint out the ineptitude of the Egyptian government. How does this contribute to the overall tone, and how does it relate to us as readers?
Well, I think incompetence is something that we've been facing a lot of recently, so we can relate to that pretty easily. I actually counted how many empty spots were in there, and there's 45 empty parking spots and 9 empty parking spots over there. So it just blows my mind as to why they're possibly doing this, given that they handed out 60 parking passes and yet there's 54 completely empty, unaccounted for parking spaces. So it seems like it's almost like a lack of thought, like a just inconsideration for what's going on for the other people. And I feel like this relates to Zot, because she kind of has to go through the same stuff, right? Where she feels one way, and when she relies on other people to do their job, she gets met with failure on a consistent basis. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Zot, it's kind of the Egyptian people as a whole. We see it with the bus driver and the man who got left with surgical tools stuck in his stomach. And that's kind of like what we're going through, right? We're like, we need something done, and we rely on other people to do their job, to almost like be a voice for us and act on our behalf, and yet they just fail to do so.
So I actually, to strengthen Gabby's point, there's this motif of misinformation in both what happened in the parking lot and what happened in Zot, because one of the security guards actually he pointed to this little lot near the exit. I don't know if you guys know about it. It's near the exit of the senior parking lot, or what used to be the senior parking lot. And then he's like, hey, you can go park here. This is like an overflow parking lot. But then they kicked me out. They gave me like a warning. And this is also comes up in Zot in the news sections, and also on page 10 and 11, with Ibrahim's commentary about how uneducated and misinformed the news people and employees actually are. So really, there's some pretty big themes of misinformation and miscommunication.
Okay, I want to bring up another question. So we've all that one went a lot of places. So we've all kind of accepted, or a lot of you guys have said, that Zot is representative of Egypt. And I was wondering how many of you thought she's a representative for the Egyptian people, or she's like actually an analogy of Egypt. Like Ibrahim is saying, Egypt is this awkward state whose friends, the other countries, don't talk to her. Like, you know, I just think that, I just want a clarification on whether she's an analogy to Egypt or the Egyptian people.
I don't think you can just like force analogies onto Zot. Like, I think a lot of times we force analogies onto a lot of things. Like you could say like anything is an analogy. If like the book, if it's worn down, you can say that's Egyptian society. It's worn down also. And so I don't think Ibrahim had when he was making the book, he didn't say, hey, Zot is going to represent Egyptian society and everything that entails. I think that you can maybe see some similarities there and connect them, but I don't think that there's enough evidence to substantiate that claim.
I would say, I don't know why I raised my hand. I would say that Zot is representative of Egypt, not Egypt's people. I mean, like, you could take it to be Egypt's people, but I think generally, as a rule, she is supposed to represent Egypt. And in the translator's note, the last sentence is, I hope that you will not be disappointed by this English version of Zot's story. Zot, who is Egypt, and her will to survive. So this whole novel is about, well, I haven't read the whole novel, but I assume that the whole novel is about, is poking fun at Egypt and saying how how they have failing infrastructure, how people are horribly misguided, and how basically it's just like a bad place to live in this time. And I think the point of writing this is Ibrahim is using Zot as representative of Egypt to say how, like, despite living in this horrible time, like, they're getting through it. Like, it's a form of protest and pointing out all of the problems with Egypt, but it's also a form of like solidarity to bring like the Egyptian people together.
Going back to Daniel's point, I feel like it's true that it's not necessarily clear whether Ibrahim intended when he was writing it to make Zot an analogy for Egypt, whether the people or the state. But I do think when he was writing it, he did intend that Zot would, like her experiences, the things she experiences throughout the book, kind of represent all the aspects, like she always experiences aspects of Egyptian society that he did want to like convey to whenever, if he was protesting or what, like he did want her to be a typical Egyptian person who experiences a lot of things that represented Egyptian society.
I think Ibrahim uses all the characters in the book to portray some aspect of Egypt, and on page 144 to 145, he talks about the new office boy, and he describes him as, he looked like he was at the end of his 40s because of the wrinkles that covered his face, and that he took 8 hours he spent every day commuting to and from his village. I just think he uses his character to portray the physical and mental tolls that the people of Egypt are enduring, and just provide one example of the poverty that Egyptian people are suffering through. So I think Ibrahim uses specific characters and their experiences to kind of generalize on the whole Egyptian society.
And off of that, I think there are two ways to approach Ibrahim's purpose. Firstly, you could see how Ibrahim is just trying to convey that it's human nature to be flawed, and that most people just have these little flaws, but then you can also look at it as a whole with society and seeing how society is completely flawed, and some of the problems that we see are shown through the characters' experiences, like the corruption or the instability, or maybe for Zot, her vulnerability. And so in my opinion, I think it's the second one, because Ibrahim's trying to hint at this bigger problem that like society is often portrayed as broken.
Yeah, I would argue that a similar point to Camilla's, because if you look at the structure of Zot as a whole, there's not really too many aspects of plot. I mean, there's some progression, but really Ibrahim is kind of picking and choosing scenes that he uses to portray the different characters, and so based off of that, I would kind of argue that he does consciously make the decision that Zot is going to be a metaphor or an analogy, and he uses that as a tool to provide his political commentary.
I also think that whether you believe that Zot is Egypt, the country, or people, she definitely represents something. On the first page of the translator's introduction, it says Zot is not usually a woman's name. It means essence, identity, or self, which means that Ibrahim purposely chose this name for her just to indicate to the reader that it's not just the person that he's talking about, it's what she represents. It's like the first page of the translator's introduction.
I think Zot's sort of experiences and like what she's dealt with are very representative of what people in Egypt face. And like that's clear through all like, the female genital mutilation and all the things she experiences. And I think Ibrahim uses this to sort of criticize Egyptian society. But I don't think you can say that she represents Egypt or that she represents Egyptian society as a whole. I just don't think that that's a valid claim and that it's really backed up in the text.
I agree with Daniel when it comes to the fact that Zot isn't representative of Egypt as a whole, because she's often so skeptical in the way that Ibrahim presents his text. It's a kind of irony, and he presents his writing as almost in satire. We've mentioned this before, and it doesn't make sense to me for Zot to be so skeptical and think lowly of Egyptian government and the way and the dynamics within relationships. So what I'm saying is, why would, if she's representative of Egypt, why would Ibrahim represent the people, represent Egypt to think badly of themselves and think, so I think really what I'm trying to get is she's more representative of possibly women in Egyptian society. However, to say she's a representative of Egypt or even the Egyptian people seems too broad.
So are you saying that if
I don't know, in like historically, when there are humans that are supposed to be like countries like Lady Liberty or stuff like that, they're like very glorious, they're women, they're all like beautiful and regal. So are you saying that like if for Zot to be able to represent Egypt, she would have to be like sure of herself?
Well,
I don't think that's an incorrect characterization of Egypt.
No, but there is, politically at least, we see a lot of, there's a lot of politics that are, or a lot of speakers on behalf of politics and the government that are saying all these things that necessarily aren't true, but they say it with confidence and they say it repeatedly. And Ibrahim and Zot present different ideas, and those ideas are more follow a trend of skepticism and disbelief of that. So, at least politically, I don't think she could, I disagree with the case that she is representative of Egypt. And then socially, she represents the voice of the women. However, for her to be the voice of the males and the men in Egyptian society, she would have to be doing more than contemplating all her, I don't know, sexual lust and all the problems she has with McGweed. She would handle them differently if she was the voice of both the men and women, I think.
I think Zot is not Egypt specifically, but I think she's a representation of how Ibrahim wants to criticize Egypt, if that makes sense. Because, like, in the newspaper section, on page 188, we read about, like, the water level in Lake Nasser is falling, and then the water level in Lake Nasser continues to fall, and then finally the irrigation minister says there is no cause of alarm, and then on page 190 he calls for prayers for rain. And so this just shows how he's like putting it off until it's too big of a problem to ignore. And I think we actually see that a lot in Zot. But I think with Zot, Ibrahim is making it more apparent in a way that where he's trying to criticize how she does this and criticize how they put off, or Zot and McGee like put off everything that they do until the last possible moment.
Another reason that might counter the idea that Zot represents Egyptian society is usually if you're using one figure to represent or to generalize an entire society, you would think she would be a lot like the other people in her society, but it seems that throughout the book she's kind of an outcast, and like with the women at her work she's always excluded, and she's one of many women who are not fully genitally mutilated, so it seems like she's kind of an outlier. So I feel like addressing Leah's point, maybe when Ibrahim originally said that Zot meant like self and identity, I think he is using Zot's experiences to criticize Egyptian society, not generalize Egyptian society, because maybe he's saying that like Egyptian society lacks self or lacks identity. Like most of the people lack a sense of identity in Egyptian society.
I think that's dangerous to try and pin one sort of big idea on Zot, because anything in Egypt right now is such a dynamic thing that, I mean, you're always going to find contradictions if you say Zot is Egypt or Zot is society, because there's so many different parts of Egyptian society that it's difficult to try and say, you know, Zot is the voice of the oppressed. Well, who are the oppressed? Who are the non-oppressed? Why are they oppressed? I mean, when we make these huge analogies, we have to kind of be careful of what that actually implies or what it doesn't imply.
So given that, I have another question about Zot in particular and her lifestyle and the life of women in Egypt. So at the end of chapter 13, Abdel Mazid asks Zot to wear the hijab again, but this time it seems different than before because Zot is like telling him about the transmission issues that she's having at work and asking like what she could do, and McGee says you'll have to wear the full hijab. So I'm wondering if this is because he's actually trying to help her, or because he is trying to do the same thing that he was before and just cover her up from everybody or all the other men in the society because of the one person there that he didn't like.
Can you repeat?